In the dead of a Colorado blizzard, a young Navy SEAL hears a sound that shouldn't exist, the cry of newborn puppies, nearly buried alive beneath the snow. He follows the sound into the dark and finds a wounded mother German shepherd fighting to keep her babies breathing with her last strength. What the soldier doesn't know yet is that this dog was once a military canine, hunted by men who want her silenced forever. One man, one wounded warrior, three fragile lives, and a miracle hidden inside a storm no one was meant to survive. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe for more stories of faith, courage, and the miracles God hides in the darkest places. The storm wrapped the Colorado wilderness in white silence, pressing down on the mountains like a held breath waiting to break. Logan Reed had chosen this place because nothing followed him here. Not the noise, not the memories, not the echo of commands shouted through dust and fire. The cabin was barely more than timber, stone, and solitude, but it held one truth he needed. No one expected anything from him inside these walls. He had been on leave for 3 weeks, suspended between the man he used to be and the man the war had left behind. Each night, the absence of his canine partner pressed heavier than the cold. The dog had died in a blast outside Fallujah, shielding him without hesitation, and Logan carried that moment the way some men carried faith, quietly, painfully, and always. The wind rose after midnight, tearing through the trees like something alive, clawing against the cabin with frozen fingers. Logan sat on the edge of his cot, boots unlaced but close, listening to the wood creak and protest. He had learned long ago that silence in hostile places was never empty. It was a language of warning. The stove had burned low. The clock on the wall had stopped weeks ago. Time here moved only by the rhythm of storms. He was about to rise and feed the fire when the sound reached him. Not loud enough to be certain, not clear enough to be ignored. A thin, broken cry, swallowed by the wind, then gone. At first, his mind rejected it as memory. He had heard that sound before in other forms. Wounded comrades calling through smoke, radios cutting in and out under gunfire, the last breath of a dog he could not save. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe slowly. The storm screamed again. Then the cry returned, closer this time, raw with desperation. Logan stood. There was no hesitation in the movement, only instinct. The flashlight lay where he kept it beside the door, batteries always fresh. He pulled on his jacket without thought, the fabric stiff with cold, and lifted the light. For one suspended moment, his hand rested on the door. The war had taught him this truth with merciless consistency. Whenever you answered a call in the dark, you paid something for it. He opened the door anyway. The storm rushed in with blinding force, snow lashing his face, the forest beyond reduced to moving shadows. The beam of its flashlight carved a trembling path across the ground, catching only chaos at first. Branches bent under ice, swirling drifts, the wild white confusion of a mountain in fury. Then he heard it again, unmistakable now, high and weak and struggling to exist. A puppy's cry. He stepped out into the storm and pulled the door shut behind him. The snow swallowed sound the moment it fell. Logan moved slowly, each foot finding purchase by instinct rather than sight. The light crossed a patch of untouched powder near the rocks, and there, almost erased by the wind, were the faintest tracks, scattered and erratic, too small to belong to anything that should be alone in a storm like this. He followed them without thinking of risk. without considering what else might be drawn to such a sound. The mountains did not care whether a man survived them. He had learned that in places far from here. The wind strengthened as the terrain narrowed between stone ridges. The cry faded, then returned again, weaker. "I hear you," he said aloud without realizing he had spoken. His voice sounded strange in a place that did not recognize it. The tracks led him toward a dark seam in the rock where snow drifted deep and uneven. The flashlight revealed movement at the edge of the beam, something low, shaking, barely upright. The beam shifted, and the world rearranged itself. A German shepherd mother stood between him and a shallow hollow in the stone, her body curved not in attack, but in fierce refusal to retreat. Her breath came in ragged clouds. She was wounded. That much he understood at once, not from what he saw, but from the way she held herself, like something that had learned pain too early and too often. A growl tore from her chest, thin and desperate, more fear than threat. Inside the hollow beneath her, 3 small shapes pressed together for warmth, blind faces lifted toward a world that had offered them only cold. Logan knelt slowly. He did not advance. He did not retreat. He lowered the light just enough that it no longer struck her eyes. The war had taught him how fear moved through living things. It did not speak the same language in humans and animals, but its grammar was identical. "It's okay," he said, the words carried off by the wind and returned broken. "I'm not your enemy." The dog's body trembled harder. The growl returned, but it faltered at the edges. She was not choosing between fight and flight. She was choosing between death and a chance she did not believe in yet. Snow crusted along her back, melting into dark streaks of ice. Logan could see the strain in every breath she forced into her chest. He shifted the flashlight beam to the hollow. The puppies were barely moving. Their cries came as sound without strength, instinct without promise. Something in his chest tightened with a sudden violence that nearly drove the breath out of him. The image of sand and fire flashed across his mind without permission. His K9 partner lying still where motion should have been, the radio screaming his name when his hands were already red. He pressed a gloved fist briefly against the snow to keep himself anchored. This was not the desert, this was not that moment, but loss had a way of disguising itself as déjà vu. He slipped his jacket from his shoulders in a single smooth motion and laid it flat on the snow between himself and the dog. It was not an offering of surrender, it was an offering of warmth. The wind fought him for control of the fabric. The mother dog lowered her head, teeth bared not with rage, but with agony. Logan did not flinch. "If you don't trust me, that's fine," he said, "but they don't have time to wait for you to decide." The words sounded colder than he intended. He did not care. Truth was often brutal when survival was short on patience. Another cry escaped the hollow, this one barely more than air. The dog hesitated. In that hesitation lived everything the war had broken and everything it had not managed to take. The dog stepped back half a pace, eyes never leaving him. Logan moved forward instantly, not rushing, not crawling, simply covering the distance as if it had always belonged to him. The jacket went over the puppies first. The heat of his hands shocked them into sound. He worked without thought, lifting each small body, feeling how little there was to hold, how fragile life became when winter decided to test it. The mother lunged then, not to attack, but to reclaim. Logan stayed where he was. The first puppy's cry grew stronger, the second followed. The third shuddered and breathed. The dog's growl broke apart into a sound that was neither threat nor relief, but something close to disbelief. Only when the last puppy moved did Logan turn his attention back to the mother. She swayed once, her legs threatening to fold beneath her. The wind struck her broadside without mercy. Logan moved closer without asking permission this time and slid an arm beneath her chest. She fought him weakly, more by instinct than power. Then her weight collapsed into his hold. The sound she made when it happened was not animal. It was a sound only something that had survived too much could make. He lifted her with the same motion he had used on wounded men in places no maps bothered to label. The puppies were bundled against his chest inside the jacket. The dog's head fell heavily against his shoulder, breath ghosting across his neck. The walk back to the cabin was longer than the distance should have allowed. Snow erased his tracks almost as soon as they were made. Logan moved on memory of terrain rather than sight. The storm howled as if offended that its claim was being challenged. More than once, his footing slipped and nearly took him down with him. Through it all, the puppies cried in brief, stubborn bursts, tiny declarations of refusal to disappear. The mother dog did not move. He did not know whether she lived or died by the rhythm of his steps, because he no longer trusted that knowledge to keep him steady. The cabin door burst open under his shoulder. Cold rushed out with him. Heat rushed in behind him. He laid the dog beside the stove first, then the puppies, against her belly without ceremony or reverence. Survival did not care about gentleness. He fed the fire until flames climbed the iron like something hungry and wild. The cabin filled with the sound of burning wood and fragile breathing. Logan sat back on his heels, chest rising and falling too fast, his hand shaking now that the storm had lost its immediate claim. He watched the puppies find warmth by instinct alone. The mother dog stirred weakly, her body shifting to create shelter even in her exhaustion. Logan said nothing for a long time. He only sat there in the firelight with his ghosts pacing the edges of his thoughts. The storm battered the cabin without pause, indifferent to everything that had just occurred. He had not gone looking for redemption. He had not gone looking for a second chance at anything. He had only followed a sound he could not ignore. Outside, the mountain roared like it always had. Inside, 3 small lives refused to listen to it. That was how it began. Not with a mission order, not with a vow, just a single cry breaking through the storm, and a man who no longer trusted miracles choosing to answer it anyway. Outside the cabin, the blizzard continued its endless assault, but inside the single room the fire had begun to carve out a fragile island of warmth in a sea of cold. Logan worked without ceremony, without the tension he once carried into every battlefield movement, yet his hands still moved with the same discipline. He fed the stove, checked the puppies one by one, then turned back to the mother dog. Her breathing was shallow, uneven, the kind that wavered on the edge of surrender. He crouched beside her and pressed his palm lightly against her ribs, feeling the faint vibration that told him she was still fighting, whether she wanted to or not. Somewhere deep inside him, a memory stirred the wrong way, an old echo of another dog gasping for air on foreign sand. He pushed it down. This was not that moment. This moment still had time. The puppies had quieted into a soft cluster of trembling softness beneath his jacket, tiny bodies pressed together with blind persistence. He watched them for longer than he admitted to himself. something tightening behind his eyes that had nothing to do with smoke. Life this small had a way of stripping every excuse from a man. He mixed warm water from melted snow with the last of his emergency rations and dipped a cloth into it, coaxing the smallest movements of breath into steadier rhythm. The mother dog stirred weakly when he brushed ice from her muzzle. Her teeth flashed once in a reflex born of survival rather than intent, then faded back into exhaustion. "Easy," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "You made it this far." The storm's voice rose and fell outside as if testing the walls for weakness. Every sound carried through the cabin with sharp clarity, the hiss of fire, the faint, wet clicks of the puppies' breathing, the uneven rasp of their mother. Logan stayed near the stove until the trembling eased from his hands. This was the dangerous part. Not the storm, not the rescue, but the silence afterward when the weight of what had happened began to settle. He had come to this mountain to be rid of the world. Now the world lay breathing at his feet. The mother dog opened her eyes fully for the first time since he had brought her in. They were clouded with pain, but not dull. There was awareness there, and behind it a calculation older than language. Logan recognized it immediately. He had seen it in soldiers arriving on stretchers who still planned to survive. She studied him without yielding. He did not look away. "You don't have to trust me," he said quietly. "You just have to stay." Her breathing wavered at the sound of his voice, but she did not pull back. That was enough. Hours passed without shape or permission. The storm did not break. The fire did not fail. At some point, Logan realized he was sitting on the floor with his back to the wall, boots still on, eyes half closed, but never fully surrendering to sleep. Each time the mother dog shifted, he was instantly alert. Each time one of the puppies cried in its dream state, he reached out without waking, touching heat to life. He had not held this kind of vigilance since his last mission, and it returned without struggle, as if it had simply been waiting for a new reason to exist. Sometime near dawn, the worst of the cold loosened its grip by degrees so small only a man who had learned to live by changes in pressure would notice. The storm's fury softened into a relentless whisper. Gray light pushed faintly against the cabin's frost-clouded window. Logan rose quietly, every joint protesting in the way they did when old injuries welcomed him back into himself. He took stock of the room with instinctive economy. Fire steady, puppies breathing, mother dog alive. He allowed himself one slow exhale before kneeling beside her again. Her breath had gained depth. The shaking that had racked her body earlier had settled into exhaustion instead of collapse. He dared to press 2 fingers lightly against the damaged leg he had only touched once before in shadow. The reaction was immediate, not violent, but tense. Pain was still very much alive there. The way she withdrew did not speak of injury alone. It spoke of memory. Logan had seen that withdrawal in living beings after traps, after cages, after betrayals disguised as hands that claimed to help. Whatever had torn her body had also torn something else that could not be stitched with warmth alone. He withdrew without forcing the contact. "We'll take it slow," he said to the air between them. He moved to the table and set out what little he had left. Water, rations, a threadbare blanket he had once dismissed as not worth carrying into the mountains, but had never thrown away. He tore it into strips with the efficiency of habit. When he returned to her side, the mother dog watched his hands but did not bar his movement. He cleaned the ice and blood from her wound with careful persistence. She flinched but did not bite. It was the smallest of agreements, and it meant more to him than she could ever understand. The puppies stirred into fuller life as the heat grew stronger. One of them let out a sharp, demanding squeal that cut cleanly through the haze of exhaustion. Logan startled and then almost laughed before remembering how to sound like himself. The sound shocked the mother dog as well. She forced her body to shift, dragging pain behind her movement, pulling the puppies closer as if anchoring them to her heart. The growl rose again in her chest, weaker than before but edged with renewed warning. Logan leaned back immediately. "You're doing your job," he said. "I won't take that from you." The growl subsided, as if she understood that promise. He watched her then, really watched, instead of counting breaths. There was a weight in her eyes that did not belong to a stray born of accident. This was not an animal that had always known hunger and fear. This was something that had once learned rules, once carried purpose. He did not speak the thought aloud, but it formed nonetheless. She had been trained, whether by soldiers, by handlers, or by people who wore authority without honor, he did not yet know. But the precision of her reactions told a history longer than the weeks of scars on her body. That realization sat heavy in his chest alongside the memory of another dog who had learned to run into fire because a man told him to. As daylight strengthened its hold, Logan moved outside to clear the path to the door. The storm had buried the world in sculpted silence, snow piled knee-deep in places where the wind had chosen to rest. The mountain lay gray and distant, patient as only old things could be. He stood in it for a moment and realized how close he had come to never standing there again. If he had ignored the cry, if the wind had been louder, if the storm had been stronger than the sound of three small voices. He stared at his own tracks, already half erased by drifting snow, and understood how thin the line between absence and consequence truly was. Inside, the mother dog was watching the door when he returned. Her ears twitched at every sound, every shift in the cabin air. Logan recognized the familiar overlay of fatigue and duty, that state where rest was allowed but never fully accepted. It was the same state that woke him every night before memory did. They were mirrors now, set on opposite sides of language. He prepared what meager nourishment he could, not knowing exactly what form of sustenance she would accept, but unwilling to leave the question unanswered. She eyed the offering with suspicion so layered it might have been painted on. One of the puppies wriggled and cried again, and at that sound the calculation in her gaze shifted. She lowered her head and took the food with careful, deliberate restraint, as if proving to herself that survival still answered to need. Logan watched without moving. There were victories that only existed if they were not claimed too loudly. Time lost its scaffolding again as the cabin settled into the rhythm of guarded recovery. The puppies fed, the fire burned, the storm withdrew by fractions. Logan's name drifted through his own mind as something half forgotten. He had lived so long as a function rather than a man that the presence of lives dependent on his continued decision to breathe felt both foreign and unshakably real. Near evening, the mother dog shifted again in a way that was not pain-driven. She lifted her head fully, eyes sharper now than they had been since the rescue. Logan felt the change before he understood it. He turned toward the door as the distant sound reached him through layers of wind and wood, a noise not born of storm, a low mechanical echo moving somewhere far down the mountain road, too steady to be weather, too unnatural to belong to the forest. The mother dog's body tightened instantly, not with fear alone, but with recognition. The sound returned, closer now. Logan rose, slowly, the air in his chest growing tight with instinct he had never managed to unlearn. He did not move toward the door. He did not reach for a weapon. He simply listened as the mountain answered within sound that did not belong to winter. The mother dog met his eyes in that moment with something like warning rather than panic. Whatever had once hunted her had not entirely lost her trail, and whatever was coming did not yet know how close it stood to a man who no longer needed a war to remember how to fight. The fire crackled. The puppies slept. And somewhere beyond the walls of that fragile refuge, the outside world began, silently, to turn its attention back toward them. The gray monotony of the Colorado mountains stretched endlessly beyond the cabin walls, the storm now reduced to distant wind and slow drifting snow that erased the world in quiet layers. Logan had learned to hear the difference between threat and memory in silence, and this morning the quiet felt watchful rather than calm. The mother dog lay on her side near the stove, breathing with more strength than the night before, her body still guarding the 3 small lives tucked against her, as if they were the last order she had ever accepted and would never abandon. Logan moved slowly, careful not to startle. He had slept little, not from fear, but from a restless alertness that refused to loosen its grip. In the early light, the cabin revealed itself without the mercy of firelight shadows. Dried blood darkened parts of the floor near where he had first laid her, now stiff and brittle. The jacket that had saved the puppies lay folded nearby, marked with damp heat and shallow claw impressions where instinct had fought survival. Nothing in the room felt accidental anymore. The mother dog watched him with steady eyes when he knelt beside her. The tension between them had shifted overnight. It was no longer raw fear. It was measurement, the kind that weighed a presence not as predator or prey, but as uncertainty. Logan understood that space well. He lived in it himself. He lowered his hand slowly into view, palms open. "You're still here?" he said quietly. "That means you chose to be." The dog did not respond with sound, but her gaze lingered long enough that he recognized consent without ceremony. He returned to her wounded leg with snow-warmed water, and the careful patience that had once saved bleeding men from dying in dust. The cloth darkened as it passed over old scars he had not seen clearly before. They were not random. They were not the ragged signature of hunger or winter. They were precise in their cruelty, marks that spoke of metal teeth and the steady hands of someone who had once set a trap with confidence that whatever entered it would never leave whole. The dog's breathing changed as he worked, not with panic, but with a distant withdrawal that reached somewhere far behind her eyes. For a moment, Logan forgot the cabin, the puppies, the mountains. He saw desert wire glinting under sun, heard the low click of mechanisms hidden beneath sand, felt the way the ground seemed to hold its breath just before it tore men apart. His jaw flexed without conscious command. Her eyes met his, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with species, recognition not of identity, but of experience. He paused, his hands. "Who did this to you?" he asked, knowing the words were only a shape for a truth that would not be spoken. The dog's ears flattened, not in fear, but in memory. It was the same look Logan had seen in mirrors he could not escape, the kind that meant the past had learned how to wait. One of the puppies shifted and cried softly. The sound broke the tension like a crack through ice. The mother dog's head turned instantly, eyes softening just enough to remind him what was still anchored inside her. Whatever she had been before, this was what she was now. Logan finished tending the wound and withdrew again. The smallest agreements were the only ones that mattered. Later, as the light rose fully and the world outside resumed its slow indifference, Logan sat at the table with an old dented tin cup of water warming between his hands. He watched the puppies stretch and fumble their way toward life with clumsy, stubborn insistence. There was something almost unbearable in witnessing existence begin where he had only known how to witness its end. One of the puppies crawled too far from the warmth and cried, and before he could move, the mother dog dragged herself forward and pulled it back with careful urgency. The motion sent a visible tremor through her body. Pain existed for her. So did refusal. It was then that Logan noticed the mark. Not a scar shaped by violence, but a deliberate imprint embedded in skin and memory. On the inside of her thigh, partially hidden beneath old fur and new blood, was a faint pattern of discoloration that had no business existing on something born to wilderness. It was not clear. Time had distorted it. But the shape beneath the damage was unmistakable to someone who had worn its mirror on his own sleeve. A number, faded, broken, still legible enough to be recognized as what it was. Logan froze. His breathing slowed without effort. The world narrowed to that single quiet realization rising from the snow of everything else. She had not been born into the wild. She had been placed into it. He did not reach for the mark. He only stared as one might stare at the echo of a voice long thought lost. The dog noticed the change in him instantly. Her body tensed in a way that did not belong to pain. It belonged to anticipation, not of attack, of departure. Logan lifted his gaze to her eyes. "They sent you somewhere," he said under his breath. "Then they left you there." The dog's ears flicked once. It was a small gesture. It felt like confirmation. The realization did not come with clarity, but with gravity. She had not simply survived brutality. She had once belonged to a world built on order and command, a world that trained living beings to run into fire because someone somewhere convinced them that obedience was survival. Logan closed his eyes briefly and felt the collision of memory surge like a wave that had spent years building its strength. His canine partner had worn the same certainty in his movements, the same silent trust, the same readiness to stop existing for another heartbeat to continue. He opened his eyes to the present, to 3 puppies pressing against a damaged but living heart, to a soldier who had not died where she had been ordered to stand, but had walked away into cold with life still pulling her forward. There was no trial where that kind of choice was recorded. Only weather, only hunger, only the echo of pursuit that did not care whether a mission had ended. Logan stood and moved to the small shelf where he kept the remnants of a life without witnesses. A folded photograph lay hidden behind cans that had long been emptied and refilled with snowmelt. He had not touched it since the night he returned from the desert without his partner. He set it flat on the table now, not as a tribute, but as a question. The image showed him and his canine standing side by side in a place that did not know their names. 2 silhouettes defined by sun and dust and the assumption of tomorrow. "This was mine," he murmured. He did not know why he said it aloud. The dog did not look at the photograph. She did not need to. Outside, the wind shifted again. Logan felt the weight of being seen by something that had learned too well what being owned meant. The dog's eyes tracked every movement of his hands now, not with fear, but with tension. Trust for her was not a door that opened. It was a distance that slowly diminished under pressure that never disappeared. The hours passed. Under that fragile treaty, Logan prepared what food he could for the puppies again and retreated to give her space to feed them. Her movements were stronger now. Though each shift betrayed pain she would never surrender to. At one point, she lifted her head and watched him from across the cabin with something like calculation returned to her eyes. It was not predatory. It was professional. The look of a being that had once been given a job and had never been told it was finished. Near dusk, a sound came from the forest that did not belong to wind or falling snow. The sharp echo of metal striking stone followed by the distant mechanical cough of something waking beneath cold. The dog reacted instantly. Her body surged upright on instinct that no longer cared what it cost. The puppies cried in sudden distress at the movement. Logan moved at the same moment, not toward the door, but between it and her without thought. Two survivors of different wars answering the same unseen signal with mirrored reflex. Their eyes locked. Whatever history lay buried beneath her scars had not buried the skill itself. Whatever once hunted her had taught her to recognize that sound without risk of confusion. Logan did not ask what it meant. He did not need to. The mountain was no longer only weather. Something with intent had remembered this place. He turned his head slightly toward the door without breaking her gaze. The sound came again, closer now, not loud, deliberate, measuring distance rather than announcing presence. The dog's muscles coiled beneath her skin, pain forgotten under something older and harder than protection alone. Logan's chest tightened with the familiar pressure of consequence approaching. Whatever she had fled from once was not finished leaving her behind, and whatever had come searching was not guided by accident. The puppies cried again beneath her movement as she stood, wounded leg trembling but unwilling to yield. "Not yet," Logan said quietly, though he did not know if the words were for her, for himself, or for whatever waited beyond the door. The fire cracked behind them. The snow outside continued to drift with relentless indifference, and the sound in the forest advanced with the patience of something that did not intend to leave empty-handed. Morning settled over the Colorado highlands with a fragile hush, the storm finally retreating into distant ridgelines, while pale winter light seeped through frozen glass and bare branches. Inside the cabin, warmth had learned how to stay. Logan woke before the fire dimmed, his body rising from half-sleep with the same quiet readiness that had once answered alarms in distant deserts. For a moment he lay still, listening not for danger, but for life. The sound reached him instantly, soft breathing. 4 distinct rhythms now, 3 small and unsteady, one deeper and strained but present. It anchored him before memory could. The puppies were awake when he stood, blind faces lifting and swiveling as if searching for something they could not yet see but already trusted. Their whimpers were no longer the desperate sound of cold, but the impatient insistence of hunger and awakening instinct. The mother dog lay beside them, alert but no longer rigid, her body positioned in a way that balanced rest with readiness. Pain still lived in her leg, but it no longer ruled her movements. Logan recognized the posture at once. It was the stance of a soldier released from immediate contact, but not from responsibility. He moved quietly to the stove, feeding it with practiced economy. Fire answered him with steady obedience. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge stolen from winter. It felt occupied, lived in, claimed. That realization struck him with unexpected force. He had avoided feeling ownership of this place for years, as if possession invited loss. Yet now, with the sound of breathing filling the space he used to guard with silence, avoidance felt like an abandoned skill. He prepared what little food he could for the puppies and waited. The mother dog did not block him when he approached. She watched every motion, every shift of his weight, yet something in the calculation had softened. He placed the offering near, but not within the tight circle of her body, a quiet gesture of respect. She studied it, then him. Her gaze lingered on his hands as if measuring the space between intent and action. Finally, she permitted the distance to close on its own terms. The puppies responded immediately, their small bodies surging forward with uncoordinated certainty. She allowed it. Trust entered the room not as surrender, but as consent. The hours unfolded with the strange rhythm of recovery. Logan cleaned the last of the blood from the floor. The mother dog shifted with more strength now, adjusting her position not only for comfort, but for control of space. Every few minutes, she tested her weight, redistributing pressure away from the damaged limb, as if teaching her body a new rule of survival. He watched without interference. Some lessons could not be given. They had to be remembered. Outside, the mountain returned to stillness. No engine sounds, no echoes of pursuit. Only wind through bare limbs and the distant crack of ice settling along stone. Logan should have felt relief. Instead, what settled into his chest was something heavier than threat, a watchfulness without noise, the sense that reprieve and safety were not the same condition. He had lived long enough to recognize that distinction. At midday, the light shifted across the cabin floor and touched the old photograph still resting on the table. He had left there without decision the night before. The image waited where it was, patient in a way that unsettled him. At last, he picked it up. The mother dog tracked the movement immediately, not with aggression, with attention. He held the photograph toward her without expectation. "That was my partner," he said softly. He did not explain the word or its cost. He did not need to. The dog did not move closer, but her breathing changed, the rhythm altered by the smallest degree. The past rarely announced itself when it arrived. It simply pulled at what already hurt. He set the photograph back down and turned away, the motion deliberate. He was not giving. He was not taking. He was only allowing the shape of loss to exist between them without being named. The puppies tumbled across the floor in clumsy exploration, their small bodies colliding with chair legs and the hem of his coat. One rolled onto its back and froze in confusion, all four limbs lifted as if awaiting instruction from gravity. Logan crouched and gently righted it with 2 fingers. The puppy squeaked in protest and then immediately tried to bite his glove with defiant seriousness. The sound that escaped him this time was unmistakably laughter before he caught it. The mother dog lifted her head sharply at the sound, eyes narrowing in reflex, then easing when no threat followed. Something in the air shifted, not dramatically, not triumphantly. It was the difference between occupation and belonging. The cabin absorbed the sound without echoing it into silence. Even the fire seemed to burn differently, less like defense, more like presence. Logan felt it move through him with uncomfortable clarity. The detachment he had built so carefully after the loss of his canine partner began to soften at its edges. He did not feel healed. He felt exposed to something he no longer had words for. Later, as the light faded toward late afternoon, the mother dog stirred and tested her footing again. This time, she rose without collapsing. The movement cost her. It showed in the tightening of her jaw, the shallow hiss of breath she could not fully suppress. Still, she stood. She turned slowly in place and surveyed the cabin with the gravity of something establishing perimeter. When her gaze passed over Logan, it did not linger. He was no longer an uncertainty that required constant measure. He was a fixed element in the environment. He stood as well not to mirror her, but to share the space without conflict. His body language shifted without conscious command from guardian to participant. The puppies pressed against her legs instinctively. She did not pull away from their weight. She leaned into it. Logan recognized the moment for what it was. Not recovery, reformation. A wounded structure learning how to bear load again through shared architecture. As evening approached, he ventured outside once more to gather what fallen branches he could reach without pushing too far into terrain that still belonged to shadow. The work steadied him. The physical demand of lifting and hauling offered structure where thought threatened to wander. The world beyond the clearing lay quiet, but not empty. Every snap of wood underfoot, every breath of cold against his face, reminded him that survival was still an active agreement with the land. When he returned with his arms full of frozen timber, the cabin seemed to take him back with a familiarity that startled him. Inside, the puppies had collapsed into small bundles of warmth against their mother. Their breathing now carried the depth of genuine rest. The mother dog rested her head on the floor, eyes open, but softened by exhaustion, no longer sharpened by fear. Logan fed the stove again and sat against the opposite wall. The distance between them remained, yet the tension that had defined it since the storm no longer carried teeth. Night fell gently. The wind stirred the treetops without violence. The mountain seemed for the first time since his arrival to be listening rather than testing. Logan closed his eyes not in escape, but in acknowledgment. For months he had believed himself finished with the role of protector, finished with the need to answer anything that cried in darkness. Now 3 small lives breathed through his walls because he had failed at that detachment. The mother dog's wounded presence mirrored his own incomplete retreat. Neither of them had been allowed to disappear. Just before sleep claimed him more fully, the mother dog lifted her head and released a low sound from deep in her chest. It was not a growl. It was not a warning. It was the sound of a being maintaining awareness while granting conditional peace. Logan did not look up. He did not need to. He accepted the sound the way a soldier accepts a watch change in the dark. Somewhere in the distance, far beyond the reach of firelight and fragile trust, the mountain shifted with a faint echo that did not belong to wind alone. He felt it more than he heard it. Again, he remained still. The puppies slept on. The warmth held. But beyond the thin shell of their refuge, something had resumed its slow approach. Night settled thick over the Colorado highlands. The cold no longer screaming, but listening, the forest holding its breath beneath a pale, fractured moon. Logan was awake before the sound came again, not because it was loud, but because his body remembered how to wake before danger learned how to knock. The mother dog reacted first, her muscles tightening with sudden clarity as if an invisible string had been pulled straight through her spine, and the puppies stirred beneath her with soft, unsettled whimpers. The sound drifted in from the lower tree line this time, distant but deliberate, the low, mechanical cough of an engine restrained to avoid announcement, followed by something sharper, a metallic strike against stone that carried intention rather than accident. Logan rose silently, every movement returning to him with the familiarity of muscle memory that had never truly left, and he moved between the door and the dog without forcing her position, simply becoming a boundary the way he once had under other skies. The mother dog did not growl this time. She watched the dark with a stillness so concentrated it bordered on violence, and Logan understood with sudden and terrible certainty that this was not a first pursuit for her, only the first time it had reached this far into her refuge. He listened as the sounds multiplied. 2 engines now, maybe 3, idling low beneath the forest canopy, their heat signatures invisible but undeniable in the way the mountains seemed to recoil from them. The night was no longer weather. It had become terrain. Logan's mind assembled possibilities with cold efficiency. Hunters, trappers, recovery teams without uniforms. Men who did not care whether a life had learned to kneel or to bleed as long as it could be counted, sold, or erased. The memory of the faint marking on the dog's thigh returned with precision, the half-erased number that belonged to systems that never admitted loss. He did not need confirmation. The mother dog's body already carried it. A faint beam of light sliced briefly through the distant trees and vanished, testing, measuring, searching for proof of movement. The puppies whimpered again, louder this time, and Logan felt the fragile risk of sound tightening around his chest like a drawn wire. He crouched and placed one steady hand near the puppies without touching them, offering weight without interference. The mother dog's eyes flicked to him once, then back to the forest. An unspoken transaction passed between them. There would be no retreat through fear. There would only be choice through action. The engines cut momentarily, and the silence that followed was worse than sound. Logan recognized the strategy. Let the prey reveal itself through breath and panic. He had used it himself once in places that no longer showed up on maps. The snow shifted at the cabin's edge under slow, careful pressure. Boots, human, deliberate, trained to distribute weight without announcing it. Logan shifted his stance by inches, aligning his body with the door's frame as cover rather than obstacle. The mother dog surged forward once with a sound that was neither a bark nor a snarl, but the raw declaration of territory drawn in blood and memory. A sharp hiss of retaliation followed from the dark. Human, startled, but not frightened. Then a voice, low and measured, cut through the trees. "She's close. I can feel it." The tone was not excited. It was certain. Another voice answered from farther back, edged with impatience. "Take her clean. Don't damage the pups. They're still worth something." The words dropped into the clearing like ash. Logan felt the bottom of his restraint crack. The mother dog lunged without permission from pain or caution, her wounded leg barely slowing the force of her refusal, and Logan moved with her in the same instant, no longer a shield, but a weapon, launched by decision. The door burst open under his shoulder, and the night rushed in with fragmented light and snow driven sideways by engine-stirred air. Two figures emerged from the trees in partial silhouette, masked by winter gear without insignia, carrying tools made quiet by experience. Logan closed the distance with the same economy that had once crossed streets under fire. The first man swung too late, surprised by resistance where he had expected flight, and Logan drove into him with the remembered violence of survival, knocking him sideways into snow that consumed the sound of impact. The second man raised his weapon in reflex rather than control. The mother dog hit him from the side with a force that carried more than muscle. It carried everything she refused to surrender, and he went down drowning in white and shock. The puppies cried behind them. The engines roared suddenly in response, ignition flaring with urgency now that concealment had failed. A third figure moved at the tree line, retreating toward the sound as if survival had suddenly recalculated itself. Logan did not chase. He did not fire. He stood between the fallen men and the life behind him, as if that geometry could still rewrite consequence. The man he had struck rolled onto his side, groaning into snow, the reality of pain, teaching him caution faster than loyalty ever could. The mother dog remained rigid over the second man, her teeth inches from his face, not biting yet, waiting for instruction she no longer required but still honored. Logan met her eyes. "Enough," he said quietly. Not a command. A mutual recognition of line held. She stepped back one pace, never losing orientation to the threat. Sirens did not follow. Law did not announce itself. Only the engines withdrew with angry acceleration through the trees, abandoning wounded without apology, the way organizations always did when cost surpassed value. The clearing exhaled slowly. Logan bound the fallen men with rope taken from the cabin and left them breathing in the cold they had chosen to enter. By the time the forest swallowed their retreat completely, the only sound left was the trembling breath of puppies and the low rasp of the mother dog, steadying herself back into standing. Logan closed the door against the night with controlled finality, sealing warmth back into fragile dominance. Inside, the fire still burned. The puppies pressed into the curve of their mother's body as if nothing in the world beyond her chest could exist. Logan crouched near them, his hands shaking now that the violence had been answered rather than anticipated. The mother dog lowered her head toward him, not in submission, not in thanks, but in recognition of shared ground claimed. He rested his forehead briefly against hers without thinking, two survivors bracing in the aftermath of impact rather than the promise of safety. Somewhere far beyond the ridge, the engines faded into the distances they had come from, and Logan knew, without needing proof, that they would return with more care and less uncertainty. The hunt had not ended. It had only learned where to aim. Spring crept into the Colorado highlands the way healing always does, quietly and without permission, melting the mountain's grip inch by inch, while cold still lingered in shadow and memory. The fire no longer had to work through the night. The puppies no longer cried from hunger or cold, but from the raw impatience of life discovering its own strength. Logan saw the shift before he felt it. The snow thinned, the air softened, and the mother dog, who had once slept with one eye locked on the dark, began to rest with both eyes closed. The days after the hunters fled did not bring celebration. They brought labor. Logan worked the land around the cabin with steady rhythm, clearing paths, reinforcing weak timber, reshaping the environment into something that could no longer be mistaken for temporary refuge. The mother dog followed his movements from a distance at first, guarding without announcement, tracking the world with the focus of one who had learned never to assume safety simply because a fight had ended. The puppies trailed behind her in unbalanced devotion, crashing into rocks and roots as if gravity itself were a puzzle they had not yet decided to respect. Logan watched them evolve with a strange ache he could not name. Strength arrived in small, incremental victories. A puppy standing without falling, another learning to bark without fear, the mother dog allowing brief moments of distraction without snapping back into vigilance. Each change was small. Together they rewrote the tone of the cabin. The silence that once defined Logan's isolation began to fracture under warm intrusion. Sound no longer meant danger alone. It meant movement. It meant life asserting itself without waiting for permission. He did not speak often, not to the dogs, not to the wind, not even to the dead who still occupied the far edges of his memory. But he began to stay awake later than fear required and rise earlier than vigilance demanded. His nights shifted from guarding against loss to listening for breath. The difference unsettled him at first. A man can grow accustomed to emptiness faster than he can learn how to share space again. The mother dog healed with the stubborn speed of something that refused to remain broken when it no longer had to be. Her injured leg never fully lost its weakness, but it stopped defining her movement. She began to run again in short, controlled bursts, testing speed without forgetting consequence. Logan watched the way she navigated gaps between fallen trees with precision shaped by training rather than instinct alone. He no longer doubted what she had been before the mountain claimed her. He also no longer doubted what she had become beyond it. One afternoon, as the snow receded far enough to reveal the soft ruin of last autumn beneath it, Logan found the faded imprint in the earth where he had first carried her from the storm. The memory struck him with unanticipated force. He crouched there with both hands pressed to ground. That was no longer frozen, and realized how deeply the moment had fractured the life he had planned for himself. He had come to disappear. Instead, the mountain had handed him witnesses. The mother dog approached him from behind without sound and stood beside him, not above, not below. He did not look at her. He did not need to. Their proximity contained more meaning than language could safely carry. The puppies discovered the forest with reckless hunger, chasing leaves, shadows, drifting snowmelt as if each movement were something they could conquer through sheer enthusiasm. Logan interfered only when the world reminded them that it was older and heavier than they were. He pulled them from shallow creeks and thorned brush, not as owner, but as boundary. The mother dog corrected them with quiet authority that never required force. Her presence alone redefined order. Logan recognized leadership when he saw it. It never announced itself. Night yielded its hold more willingly now. The fire burned lower. The wind lost the sharp edge that had once carved its way through timber with violence. Logan slept without waking at every imagined sound. The phantom engines no longer haunted the dark. The mountain resumed the slow indifference of a place that neither hunted nor hid anything unless challenged. He understood with measured certainty that the hunters would not return soon, not because fear had defeated them, but because exposure had. They had been seen. They had failed. and organizations built on silence rarely accepted either condition without withdrawal. Still, Logan did not lower his guard. He simply adjusted it to accommodate the presence of others. The role felt familiar again in ways he had once believed forever amputated. There is a difference between being needed and being used. The war had taught him the second too well. What unfolded in the cabin belonged to the first. Late one evening, as the sky flushed with the pale gold of retreating winter, Logan retrieved the old photograph from the table where it no longer belonged to him alone. He walked to the edge of the clearing and knelt beneath the exposed roots of a pine tree, whose grip on stone mirrored endurance rather than fragility. He pressed the photograph into the earth and covered it with soil, not as a burial, but as a release. "You did your job," he said aloud for the first time since the desert. The wind carried the words without correction. When he returned to the cabin, the mother dog did not follow. She watched from the threshold as if honoring the boundary of something private he had chosen to cross alone. Time reshaped the cabin through presence rather than repair. Logan reinforced the roof not just against snow, but against years. He built a small enclosure near the tree line, not to limit the dogs, but to define the perimeter of something growing. The puppies learned where home began and where the forest resumed its ancient claim. The mother dog accepted the structure without resistance. A warrior does not reject shelter when the fight is no longer required at every breath. On the first night, rain replaced snow entirely. Logan sat on the cabin steps without fire, without fear, allowing wetness to reach his skin as proof of heat returning to the world. The dogs lay near him in a loose arrangement that required no command. The puppies pressed into warmth without desperation now. The mother dog rested her head against his boot in a gesture so simple it threatened the foundation of everything he had armored himself with since loss. He did not move away. He did not flinch. He did not mistake it for ownership. Trust settles in the body before the mind allows it language. He realized then that the mountain had not healed him. It had only stripped him of excuses for remaining broken. The scars remained. The memories retained their weight. The war did not loosen its claim simply because spring arrived. But a new structure had formed around the damage, not erasing it, only redistributing the burden across living lines that now shared it. Logan ceased thinking of departure not as a decision, as a condition no longer relevant. The cabin was no longer a hiding place. It had become a threshold between what he endured and what he now defended. The distinction mattered. The mother dog lifted her head at a distant sound. One night, long after the forest had returned to its rhythm. It was not pursuit. It was not threat. It was only a reminder that the world beyond the clearing existed without permission. She listened briefly and then lay back down. The puppies did not stir. Logan closed his eyes with the calm of someone who had survived enough answers to stop requiring questions. Snow still clung to the highest ridges long after the lower ground thawed into rich, dark soil. The mountain did not abandon winter entirely. It only loosened its hold where life insisted on returning. Logan understood that rhythm now. Some seasons break you. Some seasons remake you. And sometimes the world does not ask which you prefer before it decides for you. When the first green shoots pushed through the damp earth near the cabin steps, Logan did not speak. He simply watched the mother dog rise and guide her now sturdy offspring forward into ground that would remember them long after footprints vanished. War had taken from him with ruthless certainty. The mountain had given without explanation. And in the space between those forces, a man who had once believed himself finished found that survival did not always require an enemy. Sometimes it only required the courage to remain when leaving would have been easier. The fire burned low behind him. The forest breathed freely ahead. And in the quiet space where memory once ruled alone, 3 small lives chased the sun while a wounded warrior learned to stand without war once more. Sometimes we spend our whole lives waiting for God to answer us with thunder. We wait for signs written across the sky, for miracles wrapped in fire and light. But this story reminds us of a quieter truth. Most miracles arrive as whispers, as a cry in the storm, as a door that opens when every instinct tells us to stay hidden. Logan thought the mountain had taken everything from him. The mother dog believed the world had already decided her fate, yet God met them both not through noise, not through power, but through mercy disguised as chance. One man followed a sound into the dark. One wounded soul chose to trust again, and 3 small lives were given back to the world. Maybe that is the lesson for us today. In our daily lives, in our quiet struggles, in our loneliness, in our fear, God may not always shout. Sometimes He simply places someone in our path and waits to see what we will choose. A moment of courage, a moment of kindness, a moment of faith. Those moments change destinies. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who may be walking through their own winter right now. Leave a comment and tell us what spoke to you most. And if you believe that mercy still exists, that second chances still happen, and that God still works in ways we do not always understand, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story of faith, courage, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart in every storm, and guide you toward the miracles waiting quietly on the other side of your fear.